to remember the trail where we've come from pertaining the functions of management. So we started by having to look at the leading function, then eventually we went to the planning function, then eventually we went to the organizing function, we went to the staffing function, and now in this case, we finalized by having to look at the controlling function. So under the controlling function, we said it is just like a support, or basically what the function that actually ensures the plans that have been put in place pertaining to maybe the direction, maybe the objectives, or maybe the goals of the organization are having to be fulfilled. Or for example, now in this case, managers or leaders within the organization are still on track. They are still on track. And of course, they'll be able to achieve the set objectives or maybe goals under what the plans or maybe the strategies that have been able to formulate. So we said what normally happens under controlling function, it is that you'll be able to have a look at, or basically in this case, what we'll start with, it is having to set standards, or maybe having to come up with plans or maybe goals. So that is number one procedure or maybe process. So number one procedure, maybe process under the controlling function. So first of all, you have to determine what are basically the objectives or goals of the organization. So you first of all have to determine what are the goals or maybe objectives, or set what we call what standards that are supposed to be achieved, then in this case, you likely end up having to do what, maybe carry out, measure your performance. You can be able to measure your performance, how you're having to perform towards having to achieve the goals or maybe objectives you've been able to set under the first procedure or maybe under the first process. So in this case, once you're able to measure your performance, how you are performing towards having to achieve maybe the goals. So maybe it can be maybe for a number of years. So within the first year, you can do the measurement and actually confirm whether you are still likely on track or not. So through this measurement of your performance, then you can be able to compare the actual performance you are having, and in this case, what you had set as a standard, or what was actually the objective. So when you compare the two, you'll be able to arrive at what we call deviations. So these deviations can be able to tell you what could basically be leading to them having to happen. And therefore, you can come up with corrective measures. To ensure, maybe in this case, you are still having to achieve your objective, or you can look for other ways or other means as well. In this case, maybe you can change your plans. You can be able to change your plans or maybe objectives. So we can talk about, in this case, what has been set as a standard. Then, of course, the actual performance. So out of the standard and the actual performance, you get the variance. For example, in this case, in maybe production, it could be actually be production of a particular item. So there are those standards you've been able to set as the materials that will likely be utilized. But eventually you realize maybe you utilize excess or maybe in excess materials. So that gives rise to what we call a variance from what you had set as a standard or maybe objective. So through that, you can come up with maybe corrective measures as to how you can be able to maybe ensure you're having to achieve your objective. So we left at the point where we were having to look at different performance measurement tools, because you said the process or the stage of having to measure the performance is actually very key. So you can utilize different kind of tools, in this case, in terms of having to measure the performance. So for example, we said you can be able to use what we call budgets. You can use budgets. You can be able to do what we call maybe benchmarking. You can use what we call benchmarking. You can use what we call the balanced scorecard, You can use what we call business excellence models. You can use business excellence models. You can be able to use what we call customer relationship management systems, just to be able to measure your performance in terms of having to serve maybe your clientele. So use what we call CRM. So if I'm able to share, so we had gone up to the point of having to look at what is actually a business excellence model. So remember, if you can be able to recall very well, we looked at budgets, and I was actually able to explain so how you use the budgets or use budgeting and actually planning to measure your performance. We had actually also looked at what we mean by key performance indicators, KPIs. So in this case, you're having to work maybe as a marketer, or you're carrying out marketing. So they can be able to set for you targets that you're supposed to achieve in terms of your sales targets. Then if you achieve these sales targets, they basically indicate you're having to perform in your job as maybe in this case a marketer. So each and every employee can actually basically be given like an KPI, key performance indicator. So if you're able to achieve this particular performance, then it is an indication that you're having to perform as per the set what targets or maybe objectives. So we looked at the balance scorecard, whereby we said there has to be a balance between having to focus on maintaining your finances, whereby you have to ensure there are high revenues having to be achieved. So you have to create the same balance with having to ensure you serve your customers to their level of expectations to achieve what we call customer satisfaction. At the same time, you have to ensure within the organization there's an aspect of having to develop your employees. And of course, there's actually growth and actually innovativeness having to happen. At the same case, the internal processes should actually be top-notch. If it's actually having to manufacture products, no time in this case, there'll be a machine downtime, or maybe in this case, a machine breakdown, because this will end up having to affect all the others. So overall, these ones have to be balanced to ensure that in this case, each and every area is having to function as expected. So with that, you can be able to achieve the overall vision and strategy of the organization. So don't forget about the customers. Don't forget about your finances. Don't forget about learning and growth in the organization. Don't forget about the internal processes. See, if all of them work together coherently, then the overall vision and strategy of the organization will likely be achieved. So that is what we call the balance scorecard. So we're able to look at it. And of course, we looked at also benchmarking. So I was able to explain also benchmarking. So we left at the point whereby I just explained what we mean by a business excellence models, a business excellence model. So it is simply a model that can actually be utilized to ensure there is actually excellence in the organization. So having to achieve overall organizational excellence standards. So if you have proper leadership, proper planning, proper satisfaction of customers, having to ensure that in this case that the overall people within the organization, their needs have actually been satisfied. The processes are actually quite okay. Your partners, those you partner with, it could be suppliers, it could be your customers. Then in this case, you've been able to ensure you balance maybe their levels of needs. Then in this case, you can be able to achieve an overall business excellence within the organization. So we looked at a model that is predominantly utilized. So we call it the European Foundation Quality Model. So this particular model, it has what we call four results and actually 5 enablers. So the results expected it is that you have to ensure that the customers are happy, the people in the society are actually happy, the environment is actually overall happy, and the business is actually making money. So how do you achieve this one or these particular 4 results? You have 5 enablers to achieve this one. So the enablers are, number 1, you have to have a good leadership in the organization. So the managers are basically qualified persons who can be able to lead the organization. You have to have a proper clear-cut strategies. So strategies are basically plans you've been able to set. So they could be long-term or maybe short-term. So this where you are basically heading to or where you intend to be as an organization, maybe in the coming years. So you basically formulate strategies as to how you can be able to achieve this kind of objectives. So these strategies, they should be ones that are in this case are very clear, are well actually understood, and can actually be implemented. The people in the organization, we are talking about in this case, the human resource that you are basically having, the talent you are having in this case, you have to ensure that in this case, maybe you ensure some level of them having to maybe develop themselves for them to be very innovative. You have to develop them maybe through maybe what you call maybe training, or maybe in this case, allowing them to go for maybe further studies. So maybe in this case, having to ensure that in this case, you remunerate them so well. So you compensate them so well as expected. When the people are actually happy, then the performance levels will likely basically be high, will likely be achieved. So with that, you'll enable all these others having to be achieved, making everyone to be happy within the organization. You'll check on maybe your resources. So these are basically your finances. You have to ensure that in this case, you sell your products, ensure products are having to be sold, your services are having to be sold, to get the resources to, in this case, enable the functioning of the other areas of the organization. Then you must be having extremely good processes within the organization. So, for example, machine breakdown, as you've already been able to see previously, for example, under the balanced scorecard. So that is basically the business excellence model that in this case you can also be able to use, as I mentioned, in this case, whether you're having to achieve overall excellence within the organization. So there has to be a balance of all the aspects pertaining to the business excellence model. So how you manage your risks also is very important. So we have what we call enterprise risk management. So you can be able to have like maybe a committee within the organization that basically monitors or identifies the risks that are having to arise, having to affect the organization. And in this case, when you talk about the risks, there are so many of them. They could basically be relating to maybe your finances. You can have financial risks. We can be able to have maybe operational risks having to arise. You can have maybe in this case regulatory risks, whereby in this case you're not actually having to comply with the relevant regulations. So your business can actually end up having to be shut down. So you have to monitor that these kind of risks are not actually basically there. So the levels as far in this case you're having to control how risks are having to arise and how you can be able to go about them is actually also very important. So enterprise risk management represents a set of tools and approaches to identify, assess, and manage corporate risks. So each and every day, businesses will operate in environments under which they cannot actually avoid risks 100%. So there'll always basically be some kind of risk having to do what happened. Competitors are having to emerge from time to time. Different regulations are having to be set from time to time, affecting as to how, in this case, you operate as a business. So you are bound to face different kind of challenges or maybe risks that are having to arise. So in this case, you have to prepare yourself as to how you can either do away with the risks, or maybe in this case, you can just be able to do what reduce the entity or maybe organization having to first step. So risk management started its life very much as an internal control back from what functions. Today, it has moved up onto the boardroom agendas of most businesses. So for example, in the board level of the board of directors, they can be able to set up a committee that basically handles matters what risk management. So they can have a risk management committee within the board. So it basically evaluates the potential risks that are likely to be faced by the organization. So then in this case, once they identify them, they formulate ways or means as to how these risks can actually be reduced or they can do away with them. So organizations realize that they are facing many business risks. So on part of the components of the business risk, I've just been able to mention them. It could be, for example, financial issues. That in this case, your lenders are actually on your neck. That they want you to be able to do what? Maybe pay the outstanding amounts on time, but you cannot be able to do so. So you are struggling as a business. That is actually what a risk. That in this case, the suppliers of your raw materials are not actually supplying on time. So reason being, you haven't been able to pay them on time. Your operations have done what? Have broken down. That's it. The government has just basically formulated different regulations to be complied with before you can be able to do what? Maybe continue to carry out your operations. So you are basically facing such kind of a risk. How do you go about it? So for example, you can be able to say, maybe we have like supermarkets. Supermarkets previously were having to use what? Nylon bags or paper bags to be able to do what? Maybe do their packaging of items for their customers or maybe consumers. But a government abruptly comes up with a regulation that's whereby from a particular date that they have banned what use of maybe such kind of packaging materials. So that is basically a risk you're having to face. You have to basically formulate or devise a way as to how you'll be able to package the products of your consumers. So that is a part of the risk that can actually end up having to arise. And of course, we are saying the entity or organization cannot be able to avoid them 100%. They have to find ways as to how they can be able to handle them. So enterprise risk management should start with identifying the most important strategic risks of the organization. Once mapped, the risk can then be prioritized and checked against what? The risk tolerance levels. So there are those ones you can be able to tolerate. So you can compare the risks and the levels of, you can be able to tolerate them. So which ones can you be able to, for example, avoid 100%? Which ones can you be able to, in this case, not avoid? How do you go about them? What level can you be able to tolerate? So you can be able to carry out a risk assessment within the organization and find a way as to how you can be able to go about it. So finally, action plans need to be put in place to manage or mitigate these particular key risks. So this is then usually followed by the creation of key risk indicators that function as early warning indicators and enable business to monitor the risk levels of on an ongoing basis. Then you have the Six Sigma. So the Six Sigma is also a model you can be able to utilize. So we call it the DMIC cycle, the DMIC cycle. So the Six Sigma is a tool that was actually pioneered. So the first pioneers to ever use this particular kind of a model, we call that particular entity as what, Motorola. So in the 1980s. So it is known as the Six Sigma, but of course now in this case, there are just 5 elements about it. We call them the DMIC. So first of all, in this case, the Six Sigma actually focuses on having to reduce, for example, maybe defects in the kind of services or maybe products you're having to produce, whereby you produce top-notch or quality products. So you have basically the needs of the consumer at the back of your mind. Once you have the needs of the consumer at the back of your mind, you produce products that in this case, almost like in this case, having 0% defects, 0% defects. So it focuses on having to produce quality products that in this case, consumers can be able to do what? Can be able to buy. So it is a model you can be able to, in this case, for example, utilize in terms of having to confirm and check on the kind of products you're having to produce as an entity or maybe what organization. So it is known as the Six Sigma, but of course in this case, it just have what, 5 elements. So they are not 6 elements. So you call them the DMIC. So in this case, you first of all define the problem. But then in this case, you measure the quality of the problem, then identify the cause of the problem, then implement and verify the solution, then maintain the solution. So it is known as the DMIC. So define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. Define, measure, analyze, improve, and do what? Control. With this particular kind of a model, then you can reduce the level of defects in the kind of services you're having to do what? Maybe produce. So first of all, define the customer requirements. You'll be able to know what the customer actually needs. So you have that one at the back of your mind as you basically, for example, produce a particular product or maybe service. So that is the expectation of what? The process. So the processes you're having to put in place should actually basically be focusing on what the customer needs. So you define, first of all, what the customer requires. What is the product you're having to produce? If it is actually a phone like Motorola, so they first of all will do what? Define what, in this case, for example, maybe the customer requires. Then measure the current levels of performance. Are you basically, for example, achieving these levels of requirements for customers? So what is the frequency of what? Defects that are basically having to arise, that you end up not having to do what? Achieve what the customer actually requires. So you measure the performance. Through the measurement of the performance, you can discover what the defects that are basically arising for you not to be able to do what? Achieve what the customer requires. Then analyze the data collected regarding maybe in this case, the current performance and what the customer needs, and map to determine the cause and the effect and opportunities for what? For improvement. So when you measure your performance or when you measure to discover your defects, you find a way as to how you can maybe do away with the defects, or probably now in this case, how you can be able to maybe improve on your performance. So you can look at why, when, and where the defects are having to occur from. So improve the target process by designing solutions to improve what? Fix or prevent what? Problems having to arise. Then control the improvements to keep the processes or on the new cause having to do what? Maybe still having to be maintained. So because in this case, you're having to improve by coming up with new processes. So you'll basically do what? Ensure you basically come up with control measures. You basically maintain those processes or you continue to improve on them. So because in this case, if there's any form of laxity, it simply means that you'll end up having to do what? Go back to the old model, whereby you're having defects in your products or maybe what? Services. Defects in your products or maybe what? Services. So first of all, you do what? Define what the customer needs, measure your current performance, analyze data collected through maybe what you're having to perform and what is basically needed by the customers. Then find a way as to how you can improve in your processes to achieve the customer needs. Then you control the improvements in your processes, you control them to maintain them. So you either maintain them or improve them. If you don't control, you'll end up having to do what? Maybe go back to the old models or basically the ways that were basically leading you to do what? Maybe come up with the defective products. So that is the DMIC model. So the Six Sigma is a tool that was pioneered by Motorola in the late 1980s and later adapted very successfully by global giants like General Electric or GE and Honeywell, as well as many other companies of various sizes. Six Sigma informs managers as to the stability and predictability of processes of results. The goal is that the process defect or error rates will be no more than 3.4 per 1 million opportunities. So you basically focus on having to do what? Reduce on the defects that you are basically producing as what? Your products. So the defects in your product you're having to produce, you minimize on the levels of what? Errors or maybe defects in your products by focusing on what the customer requires, what the customer requires. So we call it the Six Sigma. So DMIC has what we call the DMIC principles. So define the customer needs or requirements, measure your performance, improve on your processes or the target processes, analyze the data first of all, then improve on your target processes, then control to, in this case, for example, maintain the processes you've been able to improve on, not to go back to the old models, So with that, then of course, in this case, you can be able to achieve the levels of satisfaction needed by the consumers or maybe customers, So that is what we call the Six Sigma. We can be able to have the performance dashboards. So these ones basically are simply tools or data analysis tools that can actually be utilized by maybe the top level management in terms of having to ascertain the levels of performance. So they can basically be utilized by maybe managers. So we call them dashboards. So certain systems or certain, for example, enterprise resource planning systems are actually able to, for example, come up with this kind of dashboards, whereby they can actually be accessed by the top level management. And of course, through the assessment or actually evaluation of such kind of dashboards, they're able to know how the entity is having to do what, maybe perform. So most organizations today are bursting with the data. So there's a lot of data that is actually there. So for example, you can be able to have like a tool like maybe this case Excel. So whereby you can be able to use it to manipulate data or come up with maybe different kind of presentations, whether it is maybe in this case pie charts, bar graphs, line graphs, just to be able to indicate some kind of trends, maybe in different performance areas within the organization. It could be in terms of revenue. It could be in terms of the levels of profits that have been realized over a particular period of time. So such kind of presentations, then in this case, we can be able to, they can actually be utilized, for example, by the managers, just to have like a kind of like an overview of different performances in different areas within the organization. So these kind of levels of performance, then of course, it can be able to enable them, maybe in this case, come up with maybe what they're having to do, what set as maybe objectives, maybe as plans, maybe as strategies where they're having to do what head. So they basically just view these kind of dashboards, these kind of presentations, and they have like, in a nutshell, a picture of the performance of the organization. So with these, then of course, they can be able to make what? The long-term plans or strategies, because they are formulated by the top level managers. So dashboards provide single page at a glance. That's what I'm trying to say. So you have a lot of data, but of course now in this case, it is like an annual data that has been presented, but you simply simplify it by using what? A pie chart or a bar graph or a line graph that basically indicates how basically the trend has been happening over the periods. So that you can be able to have all that kind of information in like a simple, just a single page, and you have like a glance. You don't have to delve so much deeper into each and every figure that is basically supposed to be presented. So you can be able to have like a single page what glance of the levels of what performance within the organization. So they are designed to effectively communicate performance information using elements such as visuals, graphs, traffic lights, and what, of course, what we call what text. Good dashboards make it easy for the reader to understand the key messages so they can concentrate on using insights to make better informed business decisions. So it enables the top level managers to make better informed what decisions, set objectives, set plans, and come up with what maybe long-term goals. So performance dashboards, that is basically how they can actually be utilized in terms of having to evaluate performance and try to gauge where the organization or maybe entity is actually headed to, So we can be able to have what we call CRM or customer relationship management. So there are those organizations that now in this case, for example, have like what we call what customer relationship officers. So like a company like, let's say, for example, maybe Safaricom, So they have like a call center that has so many customer relationship officers. So these officers basically having to communicate with the customers or consumers from time to time, trying to resolve what their issues. So sometimes in this case, when you make such kind of a call to such kind of an organization, you'll basically hear you having to be informed before you even start having to talk to the customer care. That in this case, just note that the conversation is actually going to do what? To be recorded. Or in this case, maybe evaluation, so that in this case, it can actually be evaluated, or maybe having to find a way as to how maybe they can be able to improve on having to serve you as a customer. So those kind of, for example, in this case, recordings are basically maybe in this case put in what we call a customer relationship management system that basically captures those kind of calls. It could be even be messagings, and of course, they're actually evaluated. So through the reactions of the customers, they can be able to measure the levels of satisfaction of the customers. If there are so many complaints, it simply means that in this case, from the system, they can be able to evaluate the levels of performance in terms of having to achieve the customer needs. So most companies want to make sure that they are not only have satisfied customers, but they turn their customers into profitable and loyal customers. So through such kind of, for example, recordings, or maybe in this case, conversations, so they can be able to know whether in this case, the levels of satisfaction of their customers are quite okay or they're not actually okay. If they're not okay, they know their performance in terms of customer satisfaction. So they can be able to do maybe improve in terms of having to do achieve what the customer needs. CRM systems are used to manage a company's interactions and relationships with their existing and potential customers. It usually involves using technology and software applications to track and monitor any interactions with the customers. So from sales activities to customer service or customer support. The most simple form of CRM is just tackling the various levels of interactions, taking the various levels of interactions. So most sophisticated approaches involve using CRM technology to measure conversion rates, identify opportunities to cross-sell or upsell, creating early warning systems to identify customers that might not want to do to leave. So now in this case, such kind of, for example, in this case, systems, they can be able to, for example, in this case, maybe categorize their consumers. Be able to, for example, confirm their levels of conversion. That in this case, in your call center, you are basically expecting customers to call and of course do maybe purchase or acquire products. So if you have let's say, for example, maybe in this case, 30 calls, you can be able to measure through such kind of a system. Out of the 30 calls, how many were you able to do convert to purchase a product or to buy a product? So we can be able to say, for example, now in this case, RCM, so averagely in a day, they get how many calls? Let's say, for example, 50. So 50 calls are basically, for example, potential students who want to do maybe enroll. So if you have such kind of a system, you can be able to maybe in this case, measure the level of conversion. So if you get 50 calls from students, it simply means that you can be able to check out of the 50 in a day, you're able to convert maybe 30 to enroll for classes. So through such kind of systems, then you can be able to know, maybe categorize your customers. You can basically, in this case, identify different kind of models pertaining to your customers. Those ones, in this case, who could actually end up having to acquire high-valued products. Those ones who end up having to acquire maybe low-valued products. You can be able to categorize them. And of course, now in this case, do create them or make them to become very loyal customers or maybe consumers. So these kind of CRM systems, they can be able to do enable you measure the levels of performance in terms of customer satisfaction levels, So we can call it the CRM system or CRM model that you can be able to use. So you have performance appraisal. So this one is almost connected to what you've already looked at, what we call key performance indicators. So when you have a key performance indicator as an employee, so your performance will basically be appraised dependent upon how you've been able to achieve your key performance indicator. As we said previously, for example, if you are a payables accountant, you're in charge of having to pay the suppliers. So if there are 0 complaints from suppliers of delayed payments, that could actually basically be an indicator you're having to perform. So in this case, you'll be able to go to maybe in this case, maybe the panel having to evaluate your performance. So they'll basically be comparing how you've been able to perform, comparing with the key performance indicators. So if there have been a number of complaints from the suppliers of delayed payments not having to be processed on time, then it simply means you're not having to do what? Perform. So another popular performance management tool is a performance appraisal. It is basically a tool to assess job performance of individuals in an organization. So probably you can be able to appear before your manager, the direct manager you're having to report to, maybe the human resource manager. So they can be able to evaluate your performance by looking at what basically had been set as your key performance indicators and how you've been able to perform. So they are usually done annually by your line manager. So that is the tradition in most organizations. So it can be by your line manager together with maybe the human resource manager. So they'll be able to discuss your performance in terms of having to be able to compare what had been set as your targets. And of course, in this case, what you've been able to achieve. So through this, they can, for example, maybe in this case, discover what could be the reason that in this case, you're not having to ensure zero complaint from the suppliers in terms of what? Delayed payments. So through that, maybe you can be able to say or give a number of reasons. But probably in this case, the one who's supposed to sign the checks does what? Delays to sign them. So it simply means that the suppliers cannot be able to collect their checks, or you cannot be able to do what? Maybe process their payments on time. So that is what performance appraisals. Your performance is basically compared with what? Maybe in this case, what has been set as your targets, or maybe your key performance indicators. So these are basically part of the tools you can be able to utilize in terms of having to do what? Evaluate the levels of performance within what? An organization. So through these tools, you can discover deviations where you're having to make, not having to achieve what has been set as a target, and you find a way as to how you can be able to improve as an organization. You can be able to improve as an organization. So those are basically what we call what? The key tools that you can be able to utilize. So what are some of the essentials of an effective control system or control system? So it must be one that is actually very suitable. So it must be one that can be able to suit the organization. So not all of them will end up having to suit. So the control system that has been set up should be appropriate to the nature and the needs of the activity. A large firm calls for controls different from those needed by what? A small firm. So in other words, controls should be tailored to fit the needs of the organization. So you should actually basically come up with controls that in this case are basically what? Tailored towards having to achieve the objectives or maybe goals of the organization. It should actually be timely and forward-looking. So as you are basically having to evaluate your performances and coming up with the corrective measures, the corrective measures should actually basically be forward-looking because you are looking into the future. So you have to think about what the future. So if I'm coming up with control measures, so these control measures should be able to support me. And I should be able to, for example, foresee what is likely to happen in the future. So the control system should be such as to enable the subordinates to inform their superiors expeditiously about what deviations and what failures. So the feedback system should be as short and quick as possible. If the control reports are not directed at future, they are of no use, as they will not be able to do what? Suggest the types of measures to be undertaken to rectify the issues at hand when having to face what? The future. So the deviations having to arise, you should be able to react to these deviations and having to compare with what is likely to happen in future. So that in this case, probably such kind of deviations won't actually end up having to arise in future. It should be objective and very comprehensive, covering all the needs within the organization. It should actually be very comprehensive and very objective. So the control should actually be both objective and understandable. Objective controls specify the expected results in a clear and definite terms. It should be flexible, one that you can be able to, for example, in this case, maybe change a few things here and there if it is not having to work. So sometimes it cannot actually end up having to work, even though we are saying it should be future focused, looking at the future. You might discover that in this case, when you move into the future, things actually end up having to change. So it should be a control system that is actually a bit flexible. You can flex it. You can be able to flex it. It shouldn't be rigid. So in this case, if you are rigid, then you cannot actually end up having to adapt to new developments when they end up having to arise abruptly without you having to know. So it should actually be a flexible control. It should be economical. It should consider the costs that are actually involved. If it is actually very expensive, then it will be very difficult for you to be able to do what? Maybe implement. So it should be acceptable by all the members of the organization. So sometimes in this case, if you're having to come up with control measures, it simply means that you have to do what? Implement certain changes. So these changes, will they actually be accepted by all the members within the organization? It could be the stakeholders, like the owners or maybe shareholders, or any other relevant parties, for example, the employees. So the control measures you're having to put in place should be acceptable. It should be able to motivate the people to be able to come up with what we call high performance levels. So our control system is most effective when it motivates the people to achieve what we call high performance. So since most people respond to challenges, successfully meeting to tough standards may well provide a greater sense of accomplishment. So they'll really be motivated. So the kind of standards you're having to set. So when you set the standards under the control measures, they should be reasonable standards. Don't set targets that in this case are, for example, unrealistic. So if they don't achieve them, so you must be set to ones that in this case can actually be achieved at least. So that in this case, when someone achieves them, you can be able to celebrate them, and even in this case, motivate them to even perform to higher levels next time or maybe in future. It should be one that in this case, you can be able to come up with what we call corrective actions when in this case, problems actually arise. So merely pointing to deviations is not sufficient in a good control system. It must lead to corrective action. So there's that stage number 3, we are saying you discover the deviations. So don't just discover the deviations and it ends there. You must be able to discover the deviations and come up with the corrective measures. So that in this case, you can be able to avoid these deviations having to happen. So you can be able to also ensure that you reflect on the organization pattern when you're coming up with the control measures. So the organization pattern, what basically normally happens from period to period within the organization. So those patterns should be able to tell you the kind of control measures you're having to come up with, whether they likely work or they won't actually work. So we have different kind of cycles or patterns happening within the organization. The human factor or the human element, so the people within the organization. So as you said previously, in this case, they could end up having to do maybe pose what we call resistance, pose resistance, maybe changes you're having to implement within the control measures. So you have to consider the human factor or the human element. So a good system of control should find the persons accountable for results whenever large deviations take place. They must be guided and actually directed where necessary. There should be a direct control. So the system should be designed to maintain direct contact between the controllers and the controlled. And of course, the controllers here are the managers. So they're having to do control what is happening in terms of the control function. It should actually focus on the strategic points. So as you're saying, the controlling function works hand in hand with what you're calling the planning function. So you are basically in this case coming up with the control measures. They should actually be geared in terms of having to still achieve the long-term objectives or maybe strategies. So it should actually focus on the strategic points that are basically being set up within the organization. So those are basically part of the considerations to put in place or put in mind when you're coming up with the control objectives or coming up with a control function, so that in this case it can be very effective. It can be very effective. So that is the end of our controlling function, the end of controlling function. So we can take 3 minutes break, exactly 3 minutes break. Then when we come back, I think I can be able to introduce the next topic that we are going to look at. So we call it environmental analysis. So a break of 3 minutes will likely be okay. Yes, so I think we can continue. So I don't know if we are still together. Are we still together, Alan? Alan, are we still together, Alan? Grace Nuta, can we continue? Leonida says yes. Leonida Matunda says yes. Anne says yes. Philip says yes. Juliana says yes. Ben says yes, we can continue. So I want us to start on this topic. I'll be able to introduce it. And then I think we'll see probably, God willing, tomorrow whether we can be able to delve deeper into it. So it is known as environmental analysis. I can see one of our friends there on the group chat is asking, this is his first class, that he's wondering how far we've been able to cover the syllabus. So I think we've covered around, so this could be the 7th topic or what? 7th topic. So we've looked at introduction to management. We've looked at the development of the management thought. We've looked at the leading function. We've looked at planning function. We've looked at organizing function. We've looked at staffing function. We've looked at controlling function. So this is like, we can just be able to say it's like almost the 7th topic. So we still have like almost another 50% to go, almost like another 50% to go in terms of the syllabus coverage. So it's a high time. If you've just joined, you can be able to catch up with the videos on the LMS. Make sure you are connected to the LMS and watch the videos. You can watch the videos to catch up. Then I think there are some notes which I'll be able to reshare up to where we are. But I think I've shared the notes almost up to the end of the syllabus. I had already shared them. So there are those ones who are intending to read ahead. So hope you are reading ahead as we are basically covering the syllabus. So we can be able to introduce this one, environmental analysis. So the environment, how you can be able to analyze it. So organizations or maybe entities operate in an environment. So we have different kind of environments. So according to what maybe in this case, circumstances having to be faced in that environment, so we can be able to categorize it according to that. But maybe in this case, the characteristics or elements in that particular environment, we can be able to categorize it according to that. So you can look at, for example, maybe key elements about a particular industry. So they try to do what define an environment under which an organization or maybe entity is having to operate. So they define what that environment under which the entity is actually having to do what operate. So these organizations that we have or entities that we actually have, they'll actually end up having to operate in different kind of what environments that have different kind of maybe elements, maybe characteristics, or maybe circumstances. So these circumstances or environments, you can't actually ignore them. They'll end up having to have what you call an impact on as to how the organization will be able to do what operates. And even as to how in this case, it will likely end up having even to survive in the future. So you can never ignore. So RCM, probably as a school, can never ignore the environment under which it is having to do what operate. So there are different kind of elements or factors affecting as to why in this case it can continue to exist as a going concern, or maybe to be able to do what achieve its long-term objectives or maybe goals. So managers or basically business leaders, when they're having to formulate their strategies, they can never ignore the environment under which the entity is having to operate. These particular environment forces can be able to enable them define whether in this case they can be able to achieve their long-term objectives or not. So these environment forces that could actually basically maybe be from the external environment, or they can be from the internal environment within the organization. They can never ignore them because they'll have an impact when they're having to do what formulate the strategies or long-term objectives. So in short, or basically in a nutshell or in summary, top leaders or basically business leaders, when they're having to formulate long-term strategies, because sometimes you've seen entities or maybe organizations have come up with what we call long-term strategies or long-term objectives or a 5-year plan. A 5-year plan. So this 5-year plan, when they're having to formulate it or come up with it, at the back of their mind, they have to ensure that in this case, they actually try to analyze where we are, how we are having to operate in this kind of environment. These plans we're having to set up, do they actually basically, for example, rhyme with the kind of challenges that we're having to face, with the kind of maybe opportunities that are basically ahead of us in this kind of an environment? So there's what we call environmental analysis that has to be undertaken by business leaders or maybe managers when they are formulating their long-term strategies. So from the internal environment, we can have the internal environment or the external environment. Internal, it is within the organization. It is within the organization. And you have what we call the external environment. So what you'll be able to discover within the internal environment, it is that you'll be able to clearly know your strength and maybe in this case, maybe your weaknesses. So you as an individual internally, you can be able to assess yourself and be able to know at even the individual level. You already know your strength. You already know your strength. So there are those ones who will be able to tell you that I know my strength, that I'm actually very good in computational papers in CPA. The other ones will be able to tell you I'm very good in theory papers. So others tell you that they are good at computations. So you know your weakness. Theory papers, you're not so good at them. So internally, you can be able to evaluate yourself. You can be able to evaluate yourself and know your strength and your weaknesses. Your weaknesses. So of course, now in this case, from the external environment, you can end up having to discover what could be the opportunities you can be able to do exploit. You can be able to do exploit. And what in this case could probably be some of the threats that you are basically facing as an organization. When you talk about opportunities that are basically having to arise from the external environment, it could be, for example, now in this case, the biggest competitor. The biggest competitor has just been liquidated or has gone under. So that simply means that in this case, you'll have a very huge clientele base to be able to do control or take advantage of. So that is an opportunity that has just arisen. That has just arisen. Still in the same case, from external environment, we can have what we call threats. The same case when the opposite happens, when competitors are having to do emerge. When you are facing a different kind of, for example, issues like, for example, economic issues, or economic factors, high levels of inflation. Maybe in this case, the levels of consumers or your consumers having to be able to purchase your products will likely basically reduce. So their purchasing power won't be there. So that is a threat you are basically having to do face. So from within the organization or internally within the organization, you can tell yourself, because you understand yourself, you can tell your strength and your weaknesses. So the same case, in this case, from the external environment, you can just analyze and be able to know what are basically some of the opportunities I can take advantage of, and what are some of the threats I am likely to face from this external environment. So environmental analysis is described as the process which examines all the components, which could be internal or external, which has an influence on the performance of the organization. The internal components indicate strength and actually weaknesses, what I've just tried to explain, of the business entity, whereas external components represent the opportunities and actually threats outside the organization. So from the internal environment, you can know your strengths and weaknesses. From the external environment, you can discover, when you analyze it, you can discover what could be the opportunities or threats that I'm having to do face as an entity. So to perform environmental analysis, a constant stream of relevant information is required to find out the best course of action. Strategic planners use information gathered from environmental analysis for forecasting trends for future in advance. So that's what I was just trying to emphasize, that strategic plans, long-term objectives or goals, when they're having to be formulated, always at the back of the mind of those who are having to formulate them, who are most obviously the strategic thinkers within the organization, the board of directors. When they are planning for the long-term objectives, at the back of their mind, they should be able to analyze the environment and forecast what is likely to happen in future. With that, they can be able to come up with the reasonable plans. reasonable plans. So the information can also be used to assess operating environment and set up what organizational goals. So it ascertains whether the goals defined by an organization are actually achievable or not with the present strategies. If it is not possible to reach those goals, with the existing strategies, then new strategies are devised or old ones are modified accordingly. They are modified accordingly. So we are going to look at different kind of tools that in this case can actually be utilized in carrying out what you're calling environmental analysis. So these kind of tools, they are very famous when in this case long-term objectives or goals are having to be formulated. So maybe in this case, in future, probably in this case, when you advance in your studies, you can actually basically be called upon to undertake what we call an environmental analysis for a particular organization. They just want to do maybe use your analysis to do maybe formulate long-term objectives or maybe goals. So there are different tools that you can be able to utilize, which you are going to do look at them as how you can be able to use them in carrying out what you're calling environmental analysis. So what are the advantages of carrying out this kind of analysis? So the internal insights provide the environmental analysis that are used to assess employees' performance, customer satisfaction levels, maintenance of cost, etc., to take corrective action whenever required. Further, the external metrics help in responding to the environment in a positive manner and also aligning the strategies according to the objectives of the organization. So just I will try to emphasize, this environmental analysis supports or enables in formulating long-term strategies for the organization. It supports in formulating long-term strategies for the organization. So it helps in detection of threats at an early stage, which assists the entity in developing strategies for its survival. So it identifies opportunities such as prospective customers, new products, segments, and technology to occupy a maximum share of the market than the competitors. So it's all about, in this case, having to ensure, in this case, you can be able to survive in the environment you're having to operate in. So through these analyses, either internally or externally, then you can be able to discover so many things having to affect your organization, and you plan yourself accordingly to face such kind of maybe issues, or how you can go about such kind of issues, either taking advantage of them, or for example, in this case, having to do maybe having to avoid them. If there are threats, you avoid them. If there are opportunities, you take advantage of them. So the steps involved, first of all, you do what we call identifying. So first of all, the factors which influence the business entity, you can actually be able to identify them and actually list them. So you look at the internal factors and look at the external factors. You do you identify them. So it can be performed at various levels. So at the company level, at the market level, at the national level, and maybe at the global level. At the global level. So through that, you identify those particular issues that are basically affecting your organization. So the factors influencing your organization, you can be able to categorize them or identify them. Then once you identify them, you can carry out what we call scanning. Scanning implies the process of critically examining the factors that highly influence your business, as all the factors identified in the previous step affect the entity with the same intensity. Once the important factors are identified, strategies can be made for its improvement. So you can go to, for example, just scan those particular factors you've just been able to identify that are affecting your organization. So remember, this case, we're not talking about having to identify them. I've already been able to indicate. You look at internally that in this case, probably part of the factors affecting my organization, either positively or negatively, I have the best human resource or talent. So that is one of the factors that in this case I'm talking about, which is actually very, very positive. That in this case, I have the most modern machines that are carrying out manufacturing of my products. That in this case, I have very supportive suppliers of raw materials. Another thing is that I have very loyal customers. That in this case, as an organization, also part of the strength I'm having, it is that I'm the most recognized brand in the industry. So I've been there for like a number of years. So I'm the most recognized brand. So me as, for example, in this case, Safaricom, I'm the most recognized brand in this industry. So I've been there for the longest. I've been providing top-notch, high-level products and services that are not actually matched by any other organization. So that is another factor that I'm able to do what identify. So of course, you go also towards the external environment, you start identifying them, the factors that could either be positive or negative. That could actually either be opportunities or maybe what threats. Then once you do that, you do what? You scan them critically. You scan them critically. There are those ones in this case that are so much relevant to your entity. You can be able to do what? Focus on them so much. So you can be able to do what? Now analyze. So in this step, a careful analysis of all environmental factors is made to determine their effect on different business levels. So now in this case, you consider what is the effect of these factors I'm trying to list. Then in this case, you do what? You use them to forecast how you can be able to do what? Maybe take advantage of them. Or for example, now in this case, face them as you look into the future. So when you're formulating your strategies, you basically use them to forecast how you'll be able to take advantage of them. Or for example, now in this case, face them as either what threats or maybe what weaknesses that you're having as an organization. So you'll do what? You'll be able to analyze. So you can be able to analyze whereby you are saying you carefully do what? Carry out analysis. These environmental factors to determine their effect on different business levels. So different tools available for analysis include, for example, benchmarking, Delphi technique or scenario building, then forecasting. After identification, examination and analysis. Lastly, the impact of the variables is to be forecasted. So you can carry out what you're calling forecasting. So environmental scanning, as you're saying, you can be able to scan the internal or external environment. So the internal environment, we are saying it is within what the organization. Whereby you are saying within the organization, you can be able to discover two major things. You can discover maybe in this case your strength or maybe what your weaknesses. So part of the strength I've been able to tell, for example, give you an example so that we are the most recognized brand. Coca-Cola, we are the most recognized brand. We've been there for over a century, providing what soft drinks to our consumers. So that is basically like in this case, like a strength you are having as Coca-Cola. So you can also in this case, for example, identify maybe what your weaknesses. So in this case, your products are basically considered to be having what healthy effect on the consumers. So there's a lot of sugar, for example, sodas, or for example, the soft drinks. So that is basically a weakness that in this case, probably you can be able to try and actually balance. So at the same time, there may be other competitors within the region, for example, producing other products that are almost similar to yours. So that is basically as far you can be able to either scan the internal or external environment. So those are basically part of the factors you do what you consider. From the internal environment, you identify your weaknesses and your strength. External environment, you identify your opportunities and your threats. Your opportunities are actually your threats. So now in this case, what you can be able to do, if it is within the entity, you are saying you identify your strength. So your strength, you do what? You maximize on them. You take advantage of them. What about your weaknesses? You minimize. You minimize on them. If it's from the external environment, the opportunities, you maximize by taking advantage of them. If there are threats, you focus on having to do what? Minimize them. You minimize them. You minimize on them. So we can be able to have different kind of tools having to be utilized. So that is what I want us to be able to start on. So tools for environmental analysis. So we can be able to have what we call the PEST model. So the PEST analysis tool. We can use what we call the PESTEL model. You can use what we call SWOT analysis. You can use what we call the Porter's 5 Forces model. You can use the Global Competitiveness Index. You can use the SOAR model. You can use the value chain model. So there's another one that is usually the opposite of this one, but is not listed here. We call it the TOWS. You just take the opposite. You start with it. So this one simply means strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But now we have another one that is usually the other way around, but it's just having the same elements. So it is known as TOWS model, the TOWS model. So whereby you look at the threats, opportunities, weaknesses, and strength. But now in this case, under the TOWS model, you'll basically be focusing on having to do what I've just tried to explain. You'll basically be focusing or looking at two key elements, and you look at as how you can be able to balance them. So, for example, now in this case, if you're having threats and opportunities, you basically go for the strategy of what we call mini-max. If you're having threats and opportunities, you go for what we call mini-max. You minimize your threats and you maximize on opportunities. So you are basically going for those two, or basically you are working on them together. The threats and opportunities, use the strategy we call mini-max. You minimize on the threats and you maximize on opportunities. What about in this case, if you are basically looking at the strength and opportunities at the same time, you analyze them at the same time. You go for what we call maxi strategy. You maximize on both of them, the strength and actually opportunities. So that is the TAOS model. So I think I'd be able to include it in the notes. So I'd be able to also have it. So it's known as the TAOS model. So we can be able to start with the PEST model. So this particular PEST model, so it simply means political. You look at the political factors, economic factors, social factors, technological factors having to do what affect the entity. So you look at the political factors, economic factors, social factors, and technological factors having to do what affect the entity or maybe the organization. So when we talk about the political factors, we can be able to talk about, in this case, for example, the policies that are basically formulated by the government of the day. Policies formulated by the government of the day. Other political factors we can be able to look at, for example, the politics that are normally surrounding the election cycles. So they could actually end up having to do what affect your entity. So those are external forces. They actually affect your entity as to how it actually operates. For example, we've seen that in this case, in the past, when you have issues about politics, sometimes you are told that in this case, by politicians, that we shouldn't actually open our businesses. So we shouldn't actually open our businesses. So it simply means that when that actually happens, you've seen it happen due to such kind of political issues, that businesses end up having to shut the whole day. So we are told that in this case, a number of billions or at least millions within the Nairobi Central Business District are actually lost. The government is not actually able to collect tax for the day. So the revenues for the day are actually lost. So that is basically political issues having to do affect as to how an entity actually operates. When you talk about, in this case, for example, economic issues could be, for example, matters to do with maybe interest rates, inflation rates, exchange rates. So as far in this case, for example, the Kenyan shilling is actually performing against the dollar. So it is so much devalued that in this case, the Kenyan shilling doesn't have a lot of strength. So it simply means that such kind of maybe economic factors could end up having to affect how you operate. Probably, if you're involved in having to do maybe import the products you're having to sell, it simply means you'll have to do income more in having to get the products here to come here in Kenya. Maybe you are importing from China. So if the Kenyan shilling is not actually performing so well against the dollar, it simply means that there's actually a problem whereby you cannot actually be able to even bring in a huge quantity of products you intend to bring in. So you could actually end up having, for example, in this case, even charge exorbitant price to your consumers. So it will actually end up having to affect how you operate as an organization. When you talk about social factors, we can be able to talk about, in this case, for example, cultural issues. We can be able to talk about, in this case, for example, the population distribution, so that many people are basically densely, the towns or cities are densely populated compared to the rural areas. So that basically affects how you operate. Probably in this case, you have to set up branches for, in this case, distributing your product. Probably you'll end up having to set up so many of them within the cities or maybe towns. But in this case, in the rural areas, you just have dispersed branches for your products. So the social factors could actually also do affects. So Then, of course, also technological issues. So the technology that is having to be adapted from time to time, it can actually end up having to affect whether in this case you'll actually end up having to survive or not actually survive. So we can be able to compare in this case, was it Nokia or which one? So they did what they delayed in having to do what adapt technology very fast. So the products were ended up having to do what having to be first off. They were first off very easily by what emerging competitors' products. So technological issues or technological factors can actually end up having to do what affect as well also in this case you do what you operate. So PEST analysis is an analysis of the political, economic, social, and technological factors in the external environment. These ones majorly arise from the external environment. So political issues from external environment, economic from external. There's like not so much that basically you cause as an organization for them to arise. They just arise from what? The external environment. They arise from the external environment. So which can affect the activities of an organization. So PEST analysis describes a framework of macro environment factors used in the environmental scanning component of international business management. It is part of the external environment analysis and gives an overview of the different macro environmental factors that the company has to take into consideration. It is a useful strategic tool for understanding the market growth or decline, business positions, potential, and direction of what the operations. So as you are saying, we have the political factors. So these are principal to what degree the government intervenes in the economy. Specifically, political factors include areas such as, for example, tax policies, the labor and laws, the environmental laws, trade restrictions, tariffs, and actually political stability. This one I've tried to really explain it about matters what political stability. When you have demonstrations and you are told not to report to work, so it affects the operations of so many businesses. Different government policies that are having to be formulated by the government of the day. They end up having to what affect. So in a few within a few months, you are told exactly housing levy. Within a few months, you are told that in this case there has been a revision of, in this case, NHI and actually NSSF. So such kind of issues or such kind of policies, you cannot actually ignore them. So they actually affect tax policies, labor issues, labor laws. They can actually affect as to how in this case you operate as an organization. So political factors may also include goods and actually services which the government wants to provide or be provided. And those that the government does not actually want to be provided. So they are prohibited. Such kind of maybe. Economic factors include, for example, matters to do with what interest rates that are, in this case, are basically prevailing in terms of having to, for example, acquire funding or maybe loans. The exchange rates that are basically prevailing, the levels of inflation. So these factors have a major impact on how our business actually operates and make decisions. For example, interest rates affect a firm's cost of capital, and therefore, to what extent a business can actually be able to do what maybe grow or actually expand. So if the interest rates are actually very high, then the cost you're having to incur in terms of having to even raise what we call what debt capital will actually be very high. So I think you've learned about this one in finance, the cost of capital. If it is actually very high, if you're incurring so much interest, it simply means that in this case, you cannot actually be able to borrow as much as you would have wished to raise capital to do what, maybe to expand on your operations. So the interest has to do what actually affects the economic factors affecting what the levels of growth or expansion of an organization. Social factors, so these include cultural issues, which include health consciousness. So there are those ones who are very conscious about what health issues. So the kind of products you're having to produce, they are very conscious about them. So they want to be able to purchase them because they believe that in this case, it will end up having to affect their health. Age distribution, career attitudes, emphasis on safety. Trends in the social factors affect what demand of a company's products and how that company operates. For example, an aging population may imply a smaller and less willing workforce, thus increasing the cost of what? Labor. So your cost of labor will actually be very high. But in this case, for example, the population is actually what? So much aging. It is actually so much aging. The workforce is actually basically so much between around 30 to 40 years. So it simply means that in this case, the levels of or the kind of demands they'll be able to put on the table for you to be able to employ them will likely be very high. So it'll be incurring a very high cost to acquire, in this case, the labor workforce, to acquire the labor workforce. We can have technological factors. So these aspects include, for example, research and development activities, automation, technology incentives, the rate of technological change. So as technology changes, you have to adapt with it. So they can determine either barriers to entry, minimum efficient production levels, and influence of outsourcing decisions. So as technology changes, you have to do also adapt to the changes as an organization. And of course, do change very fast to adapt. Because if you delay or dilly-dally, so the others will be able to adapt the technology very fast, will be quite ahead of it. You won't actually be able to do survive or continue to do to compete. Continue to compete. So the importance of this particular kind of a tool, it helps to spot business or personal opportunities and gives an advanced warning of significant threats. It reveals the direction of a change within the organization, business environment. It helps avoid starting projects that are likely to fail. Then it helps develop an objective view of a new environment while entering a new country, region, or market. So you can use this model to analyze an environment within a country before you do maybe commence or set up operations in that kind of a country, or maybe a region, So that is basically as to why in this case you can use what we call the PEST model. So the PEST model is carrying out what we call environmental analysis. So you have the PESTEL model. So this one I think you'll be able to pick up from here tomorrow and see how the PESTEL model actually operates. So it is just the same. It's only that in this case, at the tail end of this one, they have included these two. It's just the same as PEST, but now in this case, they have included these two. So we have environmental and legal factors having to be included there. So we look at that, and of course, you have the others. We look at, in this case, the Porter's 5 forces model. We look at the SWOT analysis. We look at the SOW model. We look at also the SOW model. So that is what we'll be able to focus on tomorrow. So unless there's a burning question, then I think we can end there for now. And I just wish you a good day. So a good day. Enjoy your Friday. Enjoy the commencement of the weekend. So you can have a good day. So unless there's a question you can be able to pose, we can be able to address. But you can have a good day.